They said the swamp had a heartbeat, that if you stood close enough, you could feel it pulsing beneath your feet. Slow, wet, ancient. In the darkness, it whispered. The old men of Jacksonville used to say that the water remembers every scream that falls into it, and in the summer of 1881, it learned to remember the sound of children. The carnival came with music and smoke, wagons lined with cracked paint, and men who smiled with too many teeth. They called it the Florida Midnight Menagerie, a traveling spectacle of freaks, beasts, and the unnatural. But what people came for wasn't the acrobats or the fire-breathers. They came for the swamp pen, for the man who called himself Alligator Bob. He said he could talk to the gators, said he could make them dance, but what he really did was feed them. The act always started the same way. Bob would step out on a rotting plank above a pen of thrashing reptiles. The water below churned with teeth. He'd crack his whip, grin wide, and shout to the crowd, "You ever heard a gator sing?" Then he'd dangle raw meat, sometimes rabbit, sometimes pig, above the snapping mouths. But that night, the meat wasn't meat. It was something that moved, something that cried. A woman in the crowd screamed. Another fainted. And the sound that followed, the shriek of a mother who realized the bundle in Bob's hands was no animal, cut through the carnival like thunder. Some said it was an accident. Others said it was a trick gone wrong. But the ones who stood closest swore they saw the man laugh before he threw the crying child into the black water. The sheriff wrote nothing, the newspapers said nothing, but the swamp, they said, remembered. Jacksonville's people kept their silence. Fear does that. It teaches you how to look away. The carnival left before dawn, its wagons rolling over soft mud. The pen dismantled like it had never been there. Out in one shack by the river, a mother named Clara Johnson refused to look away. Her son, Samuel, had vanished into the swamp that night. She had seen his blanket floating near the reeds. She had seen the ripples move long after the crowd went home. Grief is supposed to end. Hers didn't. It hardened. For weeks she washed strangers' clothes by the river, scrubbing until her hands bled, listening to the whispers spread like infection. Men in taverns joked about Bob's act, about the way the gators had come running for the cry. They laughed about the crowd's reaction, and one of them said it outright. "That wasn't the first child, you know. He's been doing it for years." The words sank into Clara like stones, each rumor, each laugh, each denial. It all built toward one truth too terrible to face. The law wouldn't help her, the church wouldn't listen, but the swamp might. That night, under a sky thick with fog, Clara went to the edge of the marsh. She knelt in the mud, the water lapping at her skirt, and whispered her son's name. "Samuel," she said, "show me where he went." And though no wind moved, the reeds parted. Lantern light from the town behind her flickered and died, and from somewhere deep in the dark water, a single bubble rose to the surface, as if something far below had answered. People in town said she went mad after that she started carrying a knife under her apron, that she stopped sleeping, that she was seen walking the roads at night, following wagon tracks into the fog. But madness wasn't what moved her. It was purpose, cold and absolute. Alligator Bob kept moving south, county to county, show to show. His act grew more elaborate, his crowds larger. He bragged openly in bars that he'd fed the swamp itself, that the gators knew his scent, that they came when he called. He said it was his gift. He didn't realize it was his curse. Because every road he took, Clara followed. And if you listen to the old swamp folk even today, the ones who still hang lanterns near the cypress roots, they'll tell you the same thing, that vengeance travels quiet, patient, and barefoot. They'll tell you that in the summer of 1883, the showman finally met the same water he'd once laughed over. They'll tell you he screamed too, not out of fear but out of recognition. Because when the gators rose for him, he saw her standing at the edge of the pen, and she didn't blink. By the time the carnival reached Palatka, Clara Johnson was no longer a mother. She was something else, something sharpened by grief, starved by silence, and moved only by the pulse of vengeance. The people who met her along the road described her as quiet, polite, and pale. They did not see the knife hidden in her basket, or the way her eyes never looked at faces, only hands, boots, tracks. She had learned to move like a shadow. The world of 1880s Florida was wild, part swamp, part circus, part sin. Railroads were being laid through ghost towns, rivers were choked with cypress, and men built fortunes off sawdust and blood. The carnival thrived in that lawless border, where cruelty could masquerade as entertainment and the suffering of others was sold by the ticket. Bob Wilson, the man I called Alligator Bob, had become a legend of that world. He claimed he could make beasts fear him. In truth, he only taught men how to laugh while something innocent died. Each new town welcomed him. Each new crowd forgot the rumors. Because rumors in the South were like fog, thick, haunting and gone by sunrise. But not for Clara. She carried them like scripture. Every whisper of a missing child, every tavern brag of Bob's secret bait, every painted poster that showed him with a gator's jaw beneath his boot, each one mapped his trail. Her first lead came from a boy who sold roasted peanuts outside the fairground. He told her that Bob always arrived 2 days before the carnival opened to test the pen. No one ever saw what he used for bait. They only heard splashing after dark. The boy said sometimes when the moon was high, he thought he heard crying. He laughed nervously when he said it, but Clara didn't. She pressed a coin into his hand and walked away, her jaw locked. In the months that followed, she moved like a ghost through the towns that fed on spectacle. Ocala, Gainesville, Lake City, always too late to catch him, always early enough to find what he left behind. An empty cradle, a mother with hollow eyes, a sheriff who'd stopped asking questions. Each time she left flowers near the swamps. Each time she whispered the same words. He will feed them too. The deeper she went, the darker the stories became. In one tavern, she overheard a man boast that Bob had found a better lure than meat. He said it with a smirk, with ale running down his beard. She watched his reflection in the cracked mirror behind the bar, memorizing his face. When he stumbled outside, she followed. No one saw him again. In the morning, only the muddy imprint of his boots led toward the river. It was said Clara spoke to no one, but everyone remembered her eyes, grey, distant, and cold enough to still a man's breath. The other performers began to whisper too. They said there was a curse on the carnival now, that a woman in black had been seen at every town, standing at the tree line watching the pen, that sometimes when Bob cracked his whip, he could hear her child crying beneath the roar of the crowd. He laughed it off at first. He told his men, "Ghosts don't scare me, gators do." But the laughter didn't come as easily anymore. By the spring of 1883, his hands had begun to tremble when he lit his lanterns. He started drinking before shows, louder and meaner each night. One of his assistants quit, saying Bob had begun talking to himself, that he'd wake up in the night screaming Samuel's name. He claimed he didn't even know a Samuel. But in dreams, names have a way of remembering you. Clara, meanwhile, had become a phantom of discipline. She learned the swamp better than the men who lived in it. She could tell the time by the chorus of frogs, the weather by the silence of birds. She began sleeping by the river, moving only when she saw carnival wagons in the distance. Her knife grew dull from cleaning fish, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness. But every cut, every hunger, every mile brought her closer to the night she had promised Samuel. They said vengeance rots the soul, but in Clara's case, it refined it. She was no longer a woman lost in grief. She was grief itself, shaped into a weapon. And by midsummer, the weapon was ready. She arrived in the town of Cedar Key, a coastal place where salt air clung to everything and the swamp met the sea. The carnival was already there, the crowd swelling, the gators restless in their pen. Alligator Bob was back on his plank, whip in hand, drunker, and applause. He shouted his same old line, "Nothing pulls a gator like a crying child." The crowd laughed, but this time a voice rose from the back. A woman's voice, steady, calm, and full of venom. "Then let them hear yours." Every head turned. Bob's smile faltered. She was standing there, veil down, black dress clinging to her like smoke. He didn't recognize her at first. He didn't have time to, because the swamp had been waiting. The boards were slick, the air was heavy, and as he stepped forward, whip raised high, his boots slid, the crowd gasped, the plank cracked, and for one long, silent heartbeat, he looked directly into Clara's eyes. He saw something that didn't blink, something older than grief, something that had come to collect a debt. The water took him whole, the gators sang, and when the surface went still again, the swamp had one more secret to remember. They say Clara didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't smile. She simply turned, walked into the mist, and vanished into the woods. Her dress left no footprints, her name left no records. Only the legend remained that when evil hides behind laughter, the swamp always finds a way to feed. The swamp never gave back what it took that night, not the man, not the scream, not the truth, but what it did give was legend. By the time dawn came, Cedar Key's carnival grounds were abandoned, the wagons were gone, the posters torn down by wind, and the pen of alligators left wide open. Only the plank remained, split down the center like a wound in the earth. Locals who came to see the damage swore they heard sounds under the water, low, rhythmic splashes that didn't belong to the wind or the tide. The bravest among them said they saw a figure in black, waist-deep in the swamp, whispering into the stillness. They said her lips moved in prayer, others said in command, but either way the water listened. Within a week, the story had spread. In one version, Clara had cursed the carnival, condemning every performer who laughed that night to meet their own reflection in the swamp. In another, she'd walked into the water herself and never surfaced. And in the darkest telling, she had become one of the things that lived there, a pale figure wandering the marshes, forever whispering to the reptiles that had eaten her son. It's strange how quickly horror becomes folklore. How tragedy, when ignored, begins to rot into myth. Cedar Key's townsfolk needed distance from what had happened. The truth was too much. A mother's grief had burned through civility and returned cruelty to the source. It was easier to make her supernatural than to admit they had watched and done nothing, so they buried her story under superstition. They said her shadow could still be seen near the swamp's edge when the lanterns went out. That gators there wouldn't eat unless they heard a child cry. Men crossing the marsh at night claimed they saw ripples form in the shape of small hands, and when fog settled thick over the water, fishermen whispered, "Clara's walking again." But the truth, the real truth, wasn't buried in the mud. It was in the records nobody bothered to read, because 3 weeks after Alligator Bob's disappearance, 5 men from the carnival turned up dead in different counties, each found in water, each missing a tongue, each with a scrap of torn linen clutched in their fist, cloth so small and delicate it could have belonged to a child's blanket. No one connected it publicly, but among the lawmen there was a whisper that moved faster than ink, a name that appeared in reports, then was crossed out again, Clara Johnson. No one ever caught her, no one ever proved she lived past that summer. But what came after? The silence. The strange disappearances near every traveling carnival in the South for the next 10 years gave weight to something more disturbing, that she had become a spirit of balance. Not a ghost, not a demon. Something older, something that rises whenever cruelty hides behind laughter. Traveling shows began to change after that. Performers stopped using live animals in their acts. Carnivals avoided swamplands altogether. And when children went missing, the authorities for once began to look closer. But in the bars, where the truth always bends, the story twisted again. They started calling her the Swamp Widow, a name spoken like warning. They said she haunted men who hurt the helpless, that if you mocked a child's cry, your next sound would be your own, echoing from beneath the black water. And in every new telling, the line between justice and vengeance blurred until no one could tell which side of the swamp she stood on. Yet in the deepest layers of that myth, hidden beneath the fear, there's something else, something human, a woman who was not content to pray for justice, who refused to accept that the powerful could feed on the weak without consequence. She didn't curse the swamp, she used it. She didn't summon darkness, she became it. Years later, old hunters in northern Florida would still swear that if you lit a lantern too close to the water, you could see her reflection instead of your own. And if you whispered her son's name, Samuel, the water would bubble, as if something beneath remembered. By 1890, The story had crossed state lines. The swamp widow had become a legend told to misbehaving children and drunken men. But beneath the folklore, a few men who had known Bob personally went quiet. They drank alone, refused to travel at night, and kept their curtains drawn on humid evenings. Because they knew it wasn't just a story. They'd heard her voice once, not as a scream, not as a whisper, but as a command that came from the dark. "Nothing draws a gator like a cry," she had said. Then she made them prove it. And maybe that's what legend truly is, a wound that refuses to close, retold until it becomes prophecy. Because in every century, every generation, there's always another Alligator Bob, and somewhere another Clara waiting by the water. By 1891, Florida was changing. Railroads cut through the marshlands like veins of iron, and towns were rising where only cypress roots had once ruled. Progress, they called it. But progress has a habit of paving over its own sins, and buried beneath that promise of civilization was a truth too dangerous to print, the truth of a mother who had turned vengeance into legend. For a brief moment, the story of the Sway MP widow was everywhere. Whispers carried from dockyards to parlors, from moonshine camps to the upper balconies of the rich. People spoke her name in awe and sometimes in fear. But it didn't take long for those with power to realize what that story represented. Rebellion. The wrong kind of awakening. See, Clara's act was more than revenge. It was defiance against a world that fed on silence. A woman without wealth, without title, had exposed the rot of spectacle, cruelty, and the men who profited from both. That terrified them, because if one woman could bring down a man like Alligator Bob, what stopped others from rising against every other man who hid his violence behind charm, money, and law? So the silencing began. The Jacksonville Herald, which had once published glowing articles about Bob's carnival, ran an editorial that mocked the idea of a vengeful mother ghost. They claimed the story was superstition, a fabrication meant to frighten children and disturb business. The Florida Sun-Times printed a retraction a week later, calling Alligator Bob a beloved entertainer who had tragically drowned. By the end of that year, even the police reports vanished from public record. The official version was simple. There was no Clara Johnson. There was no murdered child. There was no swamp curse. But in the taverns, in the smoke and the laughter of men who knew more than they admitted, another truth festered. The carnival circuit had been lucrative, funded by silent investors who thrived on blood and spectacle. Plantation heirs, ex-industrialists, traveling financiers, men who had turned cruelty into enterprise. They owned the tents, the rail cars, the animals, the publicity. And some whispered they owned the law itself. Alligator Bob had been one of their darlings, a man who could draw crowds and keep the poor entertained with danger. When he vanished, the profits dipped. When Clara became a folk hero, their control cracked. They could not let that stand, so they began rewriting the myth in real time. They turned Clara from a mother into a monster, from a symbol of vengeance into a warning against it. The pamphlets that circulated through traveling shows told her story differently now. A woman who made a deal with the devil. A witch who cursed the carnival for mocking her grief. A temptress who lured men to their deaths with the cries of her lost child. Every retelling distorted her further until she no longer resembled a person at all. She was now a moral lesson, a convenient lie that kept people afraid of the wrong thing. They feared her spirit, but not the system that created her. But legends don't die from censorship, they adapt. And somewhere in the shadows of the new Florida, the myth of Clara Johnson began to seep back through the cracks. An archivist in Tallahassee would later claim that between 1892 and 1895, several shipments of newspaper archives from the swamp regions mysteriously burned en route to state storage. Entire runs of local weeklies destroyed. Reports from carnival inspectors vanished. Some of the journalists who'd written about the widow were found dead under vague circumstances, drowned, run over by freight, lost in the Everglades. Each obituary read the same, no foul play suspected, but a diary survived, a small leather-bound book found in the ruins of a collapsed general store near Palatka, its pages damp but legible. It belonged to a woman named Martha Gibbons, a traveling laundress who had worked for the Florida Midnight Menagerie, Bob's Carnival, before it dissolved. In one entry dated August 1883, she wrote, "They say the widow walks again, but it ain't her I fear. It's the ones trying to erase her. A man from Jacksonville came, asked questions about Clara. Told us not to speak her name, not to mention the baby. Said he worked for investors. His hands were clean, too clean. He smiled when he said the water keeps secrets. I told him the swamp keeps receipts. He did, and laugh." That diary disappeared from public record a year after its discovery, but not before a single page was copied. The one that ended with the line, "They think they buried her, but you can't bury what the swamp remembers." By 1896, Florida's elite had done their job well. The story of Clara Johnson was now officially myth. The swamp widow was a folk demon. The carnivals rebranded, renamed, and returned, sanitized, respectable, profitable again. The swamp shows continued, but they used tricks now, not bait. At least, that's what they said. And yet, on the nights when the air grew too still, when fog rolled in low and lanterns refused to stay lit, even the bravest of men refused to cross the water. Because something about that silence reminded them. History might be written by the powerful, but the swamp writes the final draft. And those who tried to erase her, they forgot one thing. Erased stories have a way of coming back louder. At the turn of the century, the swamp began to take again. It started with whispers in the logging camps near Gainesville, men disappearing at night, their boots found half buried in the mud beside drag marks that led straight into the water. 1901, then 1902, one every few months, always near the same stretch of land once used for carnival shows 20 years before. By then, the old-timers had already named it Widow's Water. They said it was cursed ground, but the company men laughed. The lumber companies had no use for ghosts. They built their mills, drained parts of the swamp, and told their workers to stay quiet. But when a foreman's son vanished, a boy of 4, last seen chasing a frog by the waterline, silence became harder to buy. The men who searched found nothing except a single footprint beside the bank, small, bare. That's when the letters began. Postmarked from towns that didn't exist anymore, ghost settlements swallowed by the swamp. They arrived at sheriff's offices, newspaper desks, even private homes. Each was written in the same delicate script, signed only with a single word, Mother. Most began with the same chilling line, "Do you hear them crying yet?" The sheriffs burned them, called them the work of pranksters or lunatics. But deep down, they knew better. Because the handwriting was too precise, the ink too fresh, and the knowledge too detailed. The writer described locations that only locals could know, places long buried under moss and fog, places where by morning new footprints would appear. It was said one sheriff went out to investigate after receiving his 3rd letter. He never returned. His horse was found 3 days later, grazing on dry ground, reins torn, eyes wide as if it had seen the bottom of hell itself. The next letter simply read, "Justice doesn't drown." The newspapers called it superstition, but the pattern was undeniable. Men who beat their wives, gamblers who cheated the poor, barkers who mocked crying children, they were the ones who vanished, always near the water, always near the echo of laughter that shouldn't exist. Then came 1905, the year of the New Moon Carnival. A rebranded touring show owned by a man named Thomas Carrow, another ex-associate of Alligator Bob's investors. He had heard the legends, and he intended to exploit them. The Widow of the Swamp, his posters read, a ghost that feeds the gators. It was blasphemy in ink, a mockery of Clara's grief turned into entertainment for coin. But on the first night, as the crowd gathered beneath the torchlight, something changed. The swamp was unusually quiet. No frogs, no crickets, even the gators didn't move. Then the torches went out. Witnesses later described hearing Steps in the shallow water, slow, steady, unhurried. The sound of fabric dragging through the mud. When the torches flared back to life, Caro was gone. Only his hat remained, floating on the surface of the pen. Panic swept through the carnival. Men packed up within hours. They said the swamp had taken payment. Locals who came the next morning found the wooden plank cracked in two, split clean down the middle, just like it had been in Cedar Key, 1883. This was not coincidence. Some said Clara had never left. Others said the swamp had learned her voice, had taken her rage and turned it into instinct. Now it hunted on its own. An echo of a mother's vengeance living in the black water. Reports of the widow's cry spread across Florida. Farmers claimed that when they whipped their horses too hard, the swamp would start to murmur. When a man struck a woman near the river, the water would rise without wind. Entire families began to move inland, leaving behind cabins that rotted under vines and Spanish moss. But not everyone fled. A journalist named Henry Calloway, obsessed with proving the legend false, ventured into Widow's Water in 1908 with a phonograph and lantern. He recorded his voice before stepping into the fog. The cylinder survived. He didn't. What he captured in those final minutes became one of the most terrifying artifacts in Florida's history. The first minute is nothing but his footsteps and dripping water. Then faintly, a child's cry. Then his voice whispering, "There's someone here. A woman. I think she's calling. God, she's in the water." And then, silence. But in the final 30 seconds, a low voice can be heard, calm, deliberate, and chillingly clear. Nothing draws a gator like a crying man. The recording was confiscated by state officials in 1910. Calloway's family was told he drowned, but the cylinder resurfaced decades later in a private collection, its grooves warped, the sound distorted, yet the words unmistakable. By then, the myth of the swamp widow had spread beyond Florida, carried by soldiers, drifters, and storytellers who spoke of a mother's spirit that punished cruelty, who drowned liars in their own laughter. But behind the ghost stories there was something more, something that couldn't be erased. Because the letters didn't stop. From 1911 to 1914, dozens of local officials across the South received envelopes marked with the same seal, a handprint pressed in swamp mud. Inside each one, a short note written in the same looping script. Do you remember the cries you ignored? The handwriting matched the originals from 20 years before, which means either the swamp kept its word, or Clara Johnson was still alive. By 1915, the whispers had reached Washington. Not the ghost stories. The letters. The widow's letters, as newspapers called them before being ordered to stop printing the term entirely. They came in batches now, identical envelopes arriving at sheriff's offices, city halls, even private estates. Always the same crude wax seal, a handprint pressed deep and black like swamp tar. Always the same writing, small and perfect, as if carved by patience itself. The content varied, sometimes only a sentence, sometimes a warning. But one phrase appeared again and again: justice does not drown. That was when the Bureau of Investigation, precursor to the FBI, quietly stepped in. The case file was labeled PR, Eject Widow. It was opened under the Department of Justice's Public Confidence Moral Safety Initiative, a category reserved for matters that threatened not life, but belief. The Bureau wasn't investigating murder, it was investigating faith. In the law, in reason, in the illusion that the government controlled fear itself. The first recorded meeting of the Widow Committee took place in March of 1916 in Tallahassee. 8 men sat around a table. Federal agents, state marshals, and one civilian from the railroad board whose name remains redacted. The transcript of that meeting, partially declassified in 1972, reads like a séance disguised as bureaucracy. Agent Wright. We cannot afford another panic. These letters are causing a mass withdrawal from the southern lines. Laborers refuse to enter the swamps. Marshal Trent. If it's a person, she's old. She'd be in her 60s now, maybe older. We find her. We end this. Unknown voice. What if we already found her? The rest of that page is blacked out. What followed was an operation the Bureau later denied, a systematic search through Florida's wetlands using armed survey teams. They burned dozens of unregistered homesteads, tore down shanty towns, and confiscated letters from local churches said to be spreading contagion. The contagion was belief, but the strange thing was this: the more they searched, the more the phenomenon spread. Reports came in from as far as Louisiana, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Men who mocked the story publicly would go missing within weeks. Entire riverboats found adrift with no crew. Survivors, when there were any, spoke of fog that moved against the wind, of a woman's silhouette at the shoreline, of a voice that said, "Do you hear them crying yet?" Every one of them swore they smelled swamp water, even miles inland. The Bureau grew desperate. They hired mediums, psychological consultants, even former carnival performers who claimed to know the legend's origin. One woman, Ellen Pierce, a retired fortune teller, was brought in from Louisiana for questioning. Her testimony, marked unreliable, was the last recorded mention of Clara Johnson in a federal archive. "She ain't dead. She's been walking that line between worlds since they took her boy. The swamp didn't kill her, it kept her." "Kept her?" an agent asked. "Fed her, same way he fed it. Now it feeds on the same kind of men he was." Pierce was found drowned in her hotel bath 2 nights later. The water was black with silt. After that, Project Widow vanished from federal logs. The files were classified under environmental anomalies and stored in a restricted section of the National Archives, but small fragments escaped: scraps of memos, letters between agents, internal warnings not to travel alone near swamp regions displaying folklore agitation. One memo, dated July 1917, carried a chilling directive: discredit the myth by any means necessary, associate the story with hysteria, witchcraft, or mental illness, control the narrative before the narrative controls them. And that's exactly what they did. By the 1920s, the Swamp Widow was no longer a ghost of justice. She was an urban myth, a psychological manifestation of Southern poverty. Scholars were paid to publish papers describing her as collective delusion. Newspapers printed cartoons mocking her legend, a hag in rags wailing at the moon. Even pastors were ordered to warn congregations that belief in the widow's hand was a form of blasphemy. But fear doesn't vanish when you label it. It burrows deeper, and by silencing her name, the government made her immortal. Because what they didn't realize, what they still don't, is that every story of cruelty demands its echo. Every injustice buried deep enough grows roots, and every time a man laughs while someone weaker cries, something stirs in the water, something remembers. And somewhere in the Bureau's sealed archives, behind miles of locked shelving, there's one last page of Project Widow, written by a field agent whose name was later erased. It was never meant for public eyes. I don't think she's one woman anymore. I think she's every mother who lost something to cruelty and was told to forget. Every scream the swamp absorbed, every silence that grew teeth. And if that's true, then God help us all, because we made her. By 1942, America was at war, but the swamps of Florida had already been fighting something older. The government had built new training facilities deep in the wetlands, Camp Blanding, Eglin Field, and smaller satellite sites across the Gulf. Thousands of young soldiers, many from northern states, marched into the heat, the mosquitoes, and the black water they called the bottomless. The Army engineers drained some of it, mapped the rest, and declared the terrain manageable. But then the disappearances began again. It started small, a few men missing on night patrols, their tracks ending at the riverbank. Then entire squads reported seeing a woman in the mist. They called her the Mother in Black. Some said she stood on the water, some swore she floated above it, others claimed she whispered in their ears when they were alone, "Do you hear them crying yet?" The brass dismissed it as mass hysteria, swamp gas, or fatigue hallucination. But the reports kept coming. And buried beneath those field memos, one phrase appeared over and over again, in handwriting, in typed statements, in the panicked scrawl of young men who would later refuse to serve. She knows their names. In late 1943, the Army Signal Corps intercepted a series of strange radio transmissions from within the Florida training zones. Shortwave frequencies, unregistered. Each began with bursts of static that, when slowed down, formed human words. The recordings still exist, labeled Acoustic Phenomena number 44 from 47. At minute 31 of the second tape, you can hear it clearly. A woman's voice, faint, layered under the noise. Tell them justice does not drown. The army called it interference. But a few men in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, didn't. They saw potential. Because if fear could spread this fast from a story, it could be used. So the OSS formed a unit known internally as Division 9, specializing in psychological field experiments. Their orders were simple: study the widow legend, replicate its effects, and determine whether it could be deployed against enemy forces as psychological warfare. The first tests were conducted under Project Raven, a classified program in 1944 designed to measure fear response to environmental myth stimuli. Civilians were told the experiments were about night navigation. In truth, soldiers were marched blindfolded through the swamp at night, while recordings of the widow's voice, taken from earlier field tapes, were played through hidden speakers. The results were immediate. Men broke formation, fired blinds, fly into the dark. Some dropped their rifles and wept. One officer shot himself after claiming he heard a child crying behind him, whispering his mother's name, a name the staff didn't have on record. The files say psychological contagion. The locals said she had come back, but the government went further. A secret memo dated October 11, 1944, later unearthed in the 1980s, bore the OSS insignia and a single chilling directive. Harness the phenomenon, control the narrative. If the widow is real, she belongs to us now. What followed was half science, half seance. The military invited mediums, spiritualists, and folklore historians under the guise of cultural consultants. Among them was Dr. Raymond Thorne, an anthropologist from Tulane who had spent years collecting Southern oral traditions. He vanished 2 weeks after joining Division 9. When his office was cleared out, they found a single page on his desk. The widow is not a ghost. She is a frequency. Every act of cruelty sends her vibration through time. The swamp was only her cradle. After the war, Division 9 was quietly dissolved. The official report concluded, no actionable psychological weaponization possible. But several officers who had been stationed at Eglin filed for medical discharge within months. Their reports, what few remain unredacted, describe recurrent auditory phenomena and visions of maternal figures emerging from mist. One wrote in his journal, "She wears their medals now." By 1947, the legend had escaped containment again. Soldiers returning home carried it north. Stories spread across the Midwest of a woman seen in the fog near rivers, of drowned veterans whose last words were, "She's calling." The military moved quickly to shut it down. Newspapers were paid to print counter-stories about swamp spirits and war ghosts, but in one declassified psychological assessment, a line stands out like a confession. You cannot suppress the widow. Every war creates her again. Because the myth had evolved. She was no longer tied to one swamp. Now she lived wherever the powerless were used as bait, where the innocent were sacrificed for spectacle, where men fed others to the machine and called it duty. And the strange thing was, some soldiers said they were comforted by her. They called her the mother who comes after. They said she didn't haunt the innocent, only the ones who deserved to drown. By 1949, Project Widow was officially terminated. The files were buried under non-conforming folklore anomalies. But in 1952, a routine maintenance worker at Eglin Field uncovered an old footlocker in a sealed tunnel. Inside was a stack of ruined papers, water-stained and fragile, and a single child's blanket, perfectly preserved, though it smelled of swamp water. Pinned to it was a note written in careful feminine script. "You used my pain for your games. I used your silence for my revenge. Justice does not drown." The signature at the bottom was clear. Clara Johnson. But the handwriting, according to the Bureau's forensics report, was a match to the letters from 1883, 70 years apart. Same ink stroke, same pressure, same hand, which means one of two things. Either someone was continuing her work, or the swamp had learned how to write. By the dawn of the Cold War, America was learning to live with its ghosts. Nuclear, political, and now folkloric. The government had buried the widow in classified files, burned the letters, erased the witnesses. But the swamp has a way of teaching what silence cannot forget. She came back, not through sightings, but through soul. In 1950s, radio operators across the South began reporting interference on shortwave frequencies. It wasn't music or static, it was a low, rhythmic pulse that sounded almost organic. When slowed to human pitch, the recordings revealed something unmistakable. A woman's voice repeating the same phrase over and over as if through water. Justice does not drown. It was dismissed as atmospheric distortion, a feedback loop from experimental transmitters. But privately, the Federal Communications Commission logged over 400 reports of widow frequency anomalies within a year. They never made it public. Because, as one internal memo from April 1954 stated, fear, if uncontained, spreads faster than signal. But fear had already changed shape. The story of the swamp widow, distorted by time and secrecy, began resurfacing in pulp novels, drive-in films, and midnight radio plays. None of them told the truth. They couldn't. They made her a monster, a seductive swamp witch, a creature born of lust and vengeance. The 1956 B-movie Curse of the Widow portrayed her as a temptress luring men to watery graves. Hollywood had turned Clara's grief into titillation, and yet, under the cheap makeup and fog machines, something deeper resonated. Audiences trembled, not because they believed in ghosts, but because somehow they recognized the crime, the pattern, the hidden violence that never really left. The men who funded those films, the same bloodline of carnival investors and early railroad magnates who'd profited from Alligator Bob's tours. By turning her into a myth, they were laundering their ancestors' guilt through art. But legends are patient predators. They feed on attention, even mockery. And the more they tried to trivialize her, the closer she crept back to the surface. Strange things began happening in radio studios. In 1957, WFLA Tampa's midnight host, Ray Callister, aired a live reading of a local folktale titled The Widow's Return. He laughed as he told it, mocking the legend. On air, listeners reported hearing a faint sound beneath his voice, dripping water. Then, halfway through the segment, Ray's laughter stopped. The audio spiked with a scream. When technicians burst into the studio, the chair was empty. Only the microphone remained, slick with moisture. The broadcast cut to static. The next day, a telegram arrived at the station. No return address, no postmark. Just one sentence typed on white paper. He laughed while a child cried. Ray Callister was never found. From that day, the FCC quietly banned live readings of widow stories on public radio. It wasn't superstition. It was containment. But the government saw another opportunity. By the early 1960s, America was engaged in psychological warfare, propaganda, radio broadcasts, manipulation of fear. The same OSS files from Project Widow were resurrected under a new name, Operation Nightbell. Its purpose, to study how myth could be weaponized against the Soviets. The CIA funded small-scale experiments embedding localized legends into rural communities behind the Iron Curtain, stories of haunting female figures avenging state cruelty. They called it cultural fear engineering. What they didn't expect was that the myth would follow them back. In 1962, an operative stationed in Florida, codename EEL-9, filed a field report describing unexplained events near an abandoned training site in the Everglades. Local fishermen aimed to hear crying at night, childlike, human. When investigated, no source found, but each morning the boats drift further inland. The reeds are coated in fine black mud, consistent with sediment not found within 30 miles of the site. The men refuse to fish now. They say she's marking territory again. Attached was a photograph, a blurred image of a dark shape rising from the fog, almost human, almost reflection. Across the top margin, scrawled in the operative's handwriting, same frequency, same phrase. When analysts enhanced the audio taken from the site, they identified 3 words, repeated with growing clarity. Do you hear them crying? That recording was never broadcast. The agent who made it never debriefed. The file was marked unusable asset, but something changed after that. The military didn't speak of weaponizing fear anymore. Instead, they tried to contain belief. The government began funding educational films and debunking programs on television to ridicule the supernatural, to replace mystery with mockery. Anything to keep men from remembering what happens when cruelty is left unpunished. But legends don't respond to ridicule. They evolve. And while America laughed at its ghosts on TV, the widow's shadow slipped into something new: music. By 1965, blues musicians in the Mississippi Delta began writing songs about the lady in the marsh. The lyrics weren't random. They carried old lines, nearly word for word from the original letters. One unreleased track, recorded by a singer named Luther Hanks before his sudden drowning, ends with a chilling spoken refrain. I seen her walk the bayou, robe black as sin, sayin' ain't no grave deep enough for what men do again. The record was confiscated by state police. It never reached stores. But the audio leaked through underground channels, and the phrase, "justice does not drown," became a whispered mantra among the civil rights movements of the late 1960s. Clara Johnson's story, stripped, suppressed, defamed, had come full circle. Her voice was now the sound of resistance, and in the swamp where it began, locals still swore they saw lanterns moving at night. Sometimes one light, sometimes 2, always near the waterline, always in silence. Because justice, as the widow had promised, does not drown. It waits. And in America, where the powerful still feed on the powerless, it will always find new water. By the 1970s, the swamp widow had escaped the swamp entirely. She was no longer just a ghost story whispered by fishermen or sung in blues bars. She was an undercurrent, moving through America's collective guilt like a dark tide. The country was unraveling: Vietnam, Watergate, Kent State, the oil crisis. Every institution that once claimed to protect the people was exposed for its hunger, its appetite for spectacle, for bodies, for silence. And in that hunger, the legend found fertile ground again. It began with disappearances. A group of college students from Gainesville vanished while filming a documentary on Southern folklore. They'd been exploring the ruins of an old carnival ground near Palatka, the same one that once belonged to Alligator Bob. Only one roll of film was recovered, found waterlogged inside a camera case floating near the marsh. The footage was nearly destroyed, but a few frames survived. They show lanterns, a broken plank, and what appears to be a woman's hand, half submerged, pale and gripping the edge of the board as if pulling herself from the depths. Experts called it exposure distortion, but those who saw it said the hand was reaching toward the lens, not away. After that, a new kind of fear began to spread. A series of underground pamphlets surfaced across the South, distributed anonymously at college campuses and bus terminals. They bore the same muddy handprint that once sealed Clara's letters, and a new name beneath it: the Order of the Mother Below. Their message was cryptic, but it carried the same rhythm, the same structure as the old widow writings, only darker, more organized. The Mother Below is not vengeance. She is correction. Every cruelty sinks. Every lie feeds the roots. Justice does not rise. It pulls. Authorities dismissed it as a fringe cult, but people started to vanish in patterns that mirrored the widow's legend. Abusers, politicians, men with records buried behind paywalls and power. Their cars found idling near riverbanks, their wallets and watches left neatly on the seats, always the same. No struggle, no blood, just the echo of something pulled under. By 1976, the FBI quietly launched an investigation into the Mother Below network, the successor to Project Widow, though never publicly admitted. The Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit classified the group as a decentralized cult with ritualistic justice ideology. But what unsettled agents most was their knowledge. The letters, the geography, the details about 1883 that even historians didn't have. One agent wrote in a suppressed memo, Either these people have access to lost bureau files, or someone from inside is leading them. Another noted something even stranger. All members claim to be guided by a woman's voice in their dreams. They call her Clara. They say she never ages. By the early 80s, the cult went quiet. Then, the drownings began. Small towns across the Gulf Coast reported dozens of cases fitting the same description. Men found in shallow water, eyes open, lungs filled not with river water, but with swamp sediment. The same black silt found only in northern Florida. Victims had no ties to each other, but every one of them had a record, sealed or unsealed, of violence, fraud, or exploitation. The local papers called it the dredge killings. The Bureau called it pattern widow activity. The people called it balance. The last known case was in 1985 when a Louisiana televangelist named Reverend Curtis Wynn drowned during a baptism service. Dozens of witnesses claimed a sudden fog rolled in, turning the water black. The preacher screamed mid-sermon, eyes fixed on something behind the congregation. His body was found an hour later, hands clasped as if in prayer, mouth packed with swamp mud. And in his jacket pocket, a note, handwritten in looping script, still dry despite the water. "You preached what you did not practice. Do you hear them crying yet?" The handwriting matched the widow letters. Again, forensic linguists compared them against hundreds of samples. The result came back identical to Clara Johnson's 1883 signatures. The same curvature, same syntax, same pen pressure. But there was one problem. The ink used on the 1985 note contained synthetic compounds not manufactured until 1978, meaning either someone was copying her, or the handwriting was evolving with time. That terrified the Bureau more than any ghost story, because it suggested the impossible, that the voice behind the legend wasn't just surviving, it was learning, adapting, writing through new hands. And maybe that's when the cult stopped being a cult. Because in the 90s, the Mother Below wasn't just an organization, it was an idea. Women who escaped abusive homes, mothers who lost children to negligence, workers who exposed corruption. They began quoting her letters, wearing black ribbons dipped in mud, whispering the same phrase at protests and vigils: "Justice does not drown." The media turned it into a trend. The government labeled it folkloric extremism. But the people who whispered it knew what it really was: remembrance. Every new version of America, from the carnivals to the corporations, had found new ways to feed on the powerless. And every time she returned, reshaped by rage and silence, rising again through those who refused to look away. The cult was gone, the myth was eternal, the swamp had grown new roots, and somewhere, late at night, when the air was too still and the fog too thick, truckers driving the Florida back roads swore they still saw her, a woman in black, standing ankle-deep in the ditch water, watching the headlights pass. They said if you looked too long, the radio started to whisper, the same distorted phrase just under the noise: "Nothing draws a gator like a crying man." And if you ever turned off the radio, the sound didn't stop, because the story was never about the swamp. It was about America itself, a land that keeps feeding its cruelty, pretending it can silence what it creates. But you can't kill what the guilty keep alive. You can't drown justice. You can only delay its voice. They say history never repeats. It mutates. And in our time, the swamp is no longer a place. It's a network, a frequency, a pulse beneath the glow of our screens. By 2020, the story of the widow had almost vanished from public record. The archives were sealed, the folklore sections rewritten, the few surviving letters dismissed as hoaxes. But something strange began to happen across the dark corners of the internet, in the places where silence festers. It started on shortwave again. Ham radio operators from Florida to Louisiana began reporting interference. Not static this time, but faint human voices buried under the hum of the electromagnetic noise. The transmissions came in bursts, irregular, like Morse code made of sighs. And when slowed down, the words formed fragments of a phrase that hadn't been heard clearly in a century. "Do you hear them crying yet?" A few dies. Missed it as pareidolia. The brain finding meaning where there was none. But those who analyzed the sound found something impossible. The voice pattern, when digitized, matched the exact waveform from a 1908 phonograph cylinder, the Henry Callaway recording, the one where the last words captured were, "Nothing draws a gator like a crying man." Same tone, same cadence, only now it was cleaner, stronger. The swamp had found Wi-Fi. Within months, anonymous posts began appearing on message boards, modern equivalents of Clara's letters, digital echoes of her vengeance. Each one came from a different account, each one using the same black handprint avatar. The usernames changed, but the writing did not. The same deliberate rhythm, the same chilling politeness, the same line that always appeared at the end. Justice does not drown. At first they targeted abusers, then corporate executives accused of trafficking, then politicians whose scandals were just beginning to surface. Each time, within weeks of a post, someone would disappear. A CEO found dead in his bathtub, water blackened by sediment. A shipping magnate drowned in a marina with no sign of struggle. A Florida congressman vanished during a campaign stop near Jacksonville, his car found idling beside a marsh. The engine was running, the doors locked from the inside. On the dashboard, a USB drive. Inside, a single audio file. The first 20 seconds was silence. Then, faintly, a woman's voice. "I waited a century for you to believe me." Forensic analysts traced the sound frequencies to no known source, but metadata from the file contained GPS coordinates that led to the same place every time, the ruins of the Florida Midnight Menagerie, the carnival where it all began. When journalists tried to investigate, their servers were wiped clean, accounts suspended, files erased, not hacked, corrupted, as if something inside the data rejected exposure. Then came the WidowNet incident. In late 2022, cybersecurity firms across the U.S. reported a string of coordinated data leaks tied to human trafficking operations. The leaks contained detailed logs, shipping manifests, coded financials, names of missing persons cross-referenced with shipping routes. None of it traced back to a whistleblower. No IP address. No origin. Only one signature line embedded deep within the corrupted data. Justice does not drown. It wasn't a hacker group. It was something else. An intelligence with one obsession: erasing those who profit from suffering. People began whispering again. On forums, they called her the mother in the machine. A ghost in the data, not haunting swamps now, but servers. Not whispering through fog, but through frequencies and fiber optic cables. The governments blamed it on cyber terrorism. Corporations blamed AI sabotage. But forensic linguists recognized the syntax of the embedded phrases, same sentence structures as Clara Johnson's original handwriting. Even the linguistic tics matched. Deliberate pauses, poetic repetition, precision. It was as if the widow had learned to type. When the FBI reopened the widow case in 2023, the classified documents included digital recordings of intercepted frequencies labeled anomalous vocal entities. One clip, retrieved from a Florida Coast Guard distress channel, remains the most disturbing. A trembling male voice reports, "We found something in the water. A body. No, not a body. It's moving." Then, over the static, a female whisper, "The swamp remembers." The transmission ends with a shriek, followed by the sound of gators thrashing in the distance. The Coast Guard ship was found 3 days later drifting. The deck was wet, but it hadn't rained. The crew was gone. Only the captain's log remained, written in water war. Ped ink. She's not haunting the swamp anymore. She's haunting the system. By 2025, WidowNet had become more than myth. The line between legend and operation blurred. Whenever evidence of institutional exploitation surfaced, illegal experiments, child trafficking rings, financial cover-ups, the black handprint would appear somewhere in the leak. A watermark, a warning, a signature. And though governments still deny it, leaked reports confirm that federal analysts quietly track digital anomalies under the codename Project Mother Below, a 21st century extension of Project Widow. Its mission, identify the entity behind the handprint and contain digital myth contagion. But you can't contain a story that was born from silence. You can't bury what became the conscience of the swamp itself. They say that in certain corners of the web, if you type "justice does not drown" twice into a search bar at midnight, your speakers crackle, just for a second, like a radio tuning through water, and beneath that static, if you listen closely, you'll hear the faint sound of a child crying, followed by a woman's voice saying softly, "Do you hear them now?" Because justice was never blind. It was buried. And in the end, it wasn't the swamp that fed the gators. It was us. The widow didn't die in 1883. She adapted. She learned our language. And now, she's listening. So if your screen flickers after midnight, if the audio distorts for just a moment, don't panic. It only means she's nearby, and she's still asking the same question she's asked for over a century, to every man, every nation, every empire that built itself on silence. Do you hear them crying yet?